Welcome, everyone, to the Success Elevated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Hayden Lee, and I am joined this week by a returning guest. Very excited to have him come back on and kind of wrap up Mental Health Awareness Month for us. Ashton Holbrook, our resident mental health expert. Ashton, thanks again for coming back on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
This has been great having you on. I think all of our minds, our eyes, however you want to describe it, have been open to all the things you've discussed with us, and I've learned a lot just personally about myself and the people around me, and what I can do to better help my own mental health, which is, selfishly, if for nothing else, this has been awesome just for that. And so we've had you come on kind of for the first two parts. We talked about a lot of big picture things. So For those of you that are listening, check out episode 61 and 62 of the Success Elevated podcast, which is kind of part one, part two of the mental health awareness series. Episode 3, part 3, we had Marcy Richardson come on. She's a director of HR for a really large restoration company, and had some great insights into how to deal with some of these issues in the workplace, how to establish a safe space in the workplace, which has all been, I think, really, really helpful to this conversation. And so what I want to do first is just kind of refresh our audience to, it's only been a couple of weeks, but if you wouldn't mind kind of talk a little bit about your background and what you've kind of done with your career, I guess, where you graduated from. However you want to kind of kick that off. If you'll do that initially, we'll kind of dive into the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, so I've been in mental health now for about 10 years.
Okay.
I've worked in a lot of different settings. I've done a lot of different types of treatment.
Yeah.
I graduated with my master's from Boise State University. Go Broncos! Big
Yes,
blue,
go Broncos!
Right? Blue field,
Love it.
blue football field. Currently, I work in an inpatient treatment facility,
Gotcha.
so in a hospital setting. And really, I love the type of work that I do. It's never the same thing twice. It's always changing. It's very dynamic. It's very interesting. And it's also really rewarding, too, just to be able to help people kind of get back or give back and see that change when people really start to see that change happen in their lives and see how their lives can be impacted by, I don't know, making better decisions or, I don't know, letting go of the past, overcoming things, all those wonderful things that we talk about. It's really cool to kind of just see how that comes about, from a counseling perspective. And I really enjoy that. And in addition to the schooling, I've also done a lot of other different types of trainings. I'm NCI trained, which is called nonviolent crisis intervention. It's a approach that we use in the hospital, and a lot of other types of settings use it, like in schools they'll use it and stuff like that. Yeah. It's kind of this idea of de-escalating people when they're in crisis. I got asked once, does that mean you're a hostage negotiator? And no, I'm not. No, it's nothing like that.
Okay.
It's just talking to people.
But if the situation were to come, you would, you can handle it.
No, not at all. No,
Okay.
It's just learning how to talk to people when they're upset, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a real critical skill, not only in the environment I work in, but just in counseling in general. And then I've also done work with first responders, received some training in that area. And then in addition to the schooling and stuff that I've done, there's a lot of different training or counseling interventions that I've been trained in as well, like things like DBT or ACT, CBT, things like that, which are all just different ways of how you approach somebody or how you approach them therapeutically when you're working on a problem or an issue. And they kind of provide a framework of how you deal with the problem and work through it and theoretically address it and move forward with it. So
love it.
Yeah. So bottom line is I always kind of wanted to get into this kind of work before I went back to school back in 2009, I think it was. I had worked in retail. I had worked in construction.
Yeah.
So getting into mental health was kind of a second career for me, but I feel like I've lived a pretty eclectic life. And so I'm able to draw on a lot of different life experiences, which is also real helpful.
Yes, big time.
Yeah.
Not that I have the exact same experience, but very similar in that aspect that I've worked a lot of jobs since high school, which has been good because
it is.
I think it allows you to have kind of this more well-rounded idea of what the world looks like.
Yeah.
And I've met a lot of people from a lot of different places and met a lot of different personalities. And I think it makes for a more well-rounded life.
But at the same time, I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword because there's some days when I'm like sitting at my desk, like today is a good day. It's beautiful right now in Idaho, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sitting at my desk looking out my window at the guys working outside, and I'm like, oh man, it'd be so nice to just be outside right now working.
Right. You wish you would have stuck with one thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But then like 3 months ago when we still had, 2 feet of snow on the ground and it was, 15 degrees outside, I'm like sitting at my desk, I'm like, glad I'm not out there.
I'm with you.
So it cuts both ways. So
Ashton, we the first kind of couple of episodes that we sat down and chatted, we talked about a lot of different things that I think were extremely helpful to our audience, especially just defining what is mental health, kind of identifying some of the problems that people face, and this concept of that mental health is a pendulum. I really, really love that analogy, and I think we'll mention that multiple times today. The big thing is we're coming to the end of Mental Health Awareness Month, and we've put a big emphasis on it for our team here at Spot On Solutions. The big question, I sat down with my team and we were kind of talking today about what do we do. What do we talk to Ashton about today? As we're kind of recapping this month, like what do we chat with him about today? And the question kept coming up: where do we go from here? Right? Where do us as employees or employers or just people in the world, which I kind of tend to go back to, is if you want to just be a good person, you should probably understand mental health better, right? Where do we go from here? We've learned some great things from you. We learned some things from Marcy last week, talking in just kind of an HR environment. What do you feel like is kind of some next steps or some actionable steps that we can really focus on to help us be better internally or externally to help those around us a little bit more? What do you kind of think would be the next thing? Where do we go from here?
That's a great question, because not only is that question, I think, applicable to this discussion that we've had here, and, to what a lot of employers are probably going to ask, from what we've talked about, but it's the same kind of question that the family members of patients will ask me, especially as like a patient might be getting close to discharge, what do I do to keep helping my son or my daughter? What do I do to keep helping my husband or my wife? How do I help them stay on their medications? How do I help them stay involved in treatment? And I think, number one, the fact that we're even asking that question is great, right? Because I think that just shows that we care. And as fluffy and touchy-feely as that might sound, right? I think that's awesome that we're even asking that question, that we're at that point that we can ask that. And I think that's great. And so let's acknowledge that and then move on from that. That's a great place to start. But I think there's also some tangible things that we can do to move forward so that we can help our family members. We can help our husbands, our wives, our brothers, our sisters, our grandchildren, our nieces, our nephews, our coworkers, our employees, so that we can help them as they might be struggling with their mental health. And one thing we didn't talk about in one of our previous episodes was, how do you recognize when someone might be struggling? Yeah. And
what do you do? Like if you're an employer and you're like, I feel like there's something going on. Like what? Yeah. You just approach them. Like what do you do?
And I think that's a great place to start with this. What's the next step, right? Well, how do you recognize when someone has a problem and how do you approach them? I think that's a logical place to go. And so I think recognizing when someone has a problem is step one, right? And when you're looking at if someone has an issue, I think you have to first recognize that people have patterns. In the hospital, for example, where I work, that's one of the things that I'm looking for in my job when I'm dealing with patients is what's the pattern of my patients? What are they doing day in and day out? And in the restoration business, I'm sure it's not all that different, right? Especially because these are small work crews. There's probably 2, 3, 4 guys on a crew. Yep. Tight knit, close working individuals. Right. in each other's space. You're going to know how people talk. You're going to know how people think. You're going to know how people react and act. You know, one day, you know, Steve might walk in, he's got his Red Bull and he's talking about, you know, Call of Duty last night and all the people he ganked, right?
Right, yeah.
And someone else walks in and he talks about who he hooked up with last night, you know, and everybody has their patterns throughout the day, right? And when those patterns change, that might be an indication that something's wrong.
Okay.
And you know, maybe he doesn't talk about those things, or maybe he doesn't have that Red Bull. Maybe he's late and he starts being late more often. Maybe he's wearing the same clothes repeatedly.
Yeah. It's a good thought.
You know, just little things like that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that something, you know, oh my gosh, something's wrong, we need to get him help.
Yeah, drastically wrong. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But that might mean that something's going on, and maybe as an employer I need to start paying a little more attention to maybe some bigger things that might be happening. And so looking at those patterns, looking at how they respond to those things. How do they respond to stress? I mean, I can't imagine that. One of the things your guest last week said, which really was interesting in that podcast, was you know, this is a service-based industry, right? So it's work is life.
Yeah.
And so there's very little separation between leisure time and work time. And I think that's an interesting perspective to look at this occupation from, because now how is your crew, how is your employees managing their stress? Yeah. What are they doing at the times when they're not at work to manage that stress that comes from handling the work? And so what are the patterns involved with that? And so when I see those patterns change, there might be something that needs to happen. From a counselor's perspective, when I have a patient come in, or a client come in, and every time they come in, they're super tearful and they start crying all the time, and then suddenly they stop crying, that's going to change the questions I ask. That's going to change the ways I interact. Vice versa, right? If they're not crying and then suddenly they start crying, right? That's going to change the way that I interact with them. And so it kind of goes back to awareness. And that idea of empathy that we talked about in some of the previous episodes, where you just kind of have to have that awareness of what's going on so that you can pick up on some of those subtleties in the behavior of others around you.
Yeah. The analogy that you use, and I don't know if the cameras were on or that we were recording when you started talking about empathy and sympathy.
Oh, yeah.
But I mentioned it in a recent podcast recording. I don't know if I mentioned it in last week with Marcy, or I recorded another episode that's coming out in a couple of weeks with a different guest, and it's a different topic. But I mentioned this concept of empathy that you brought up. And so if you wouldn't mind, describe the concept of somebody in a hole, right?
Yeah. So it's not my idea. It's someone by the name of Brene Brown. She talks about vulnerability a lot, and that's kind of her shtick. And she's done a ton of research on the area, done a ton of TED Talks. If you have time, check her out. She really, really, really does a phenomenal job presenting this information. And she talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And sympathy is walking by somebody who's in a hole, and you look down as you walk by them, and you look in the hole, and you're like, man, that sucks.
That sucks.
See
you later.
Yeah, see ya, right? That's sympathy, right? Empathy is getting down, walking by them, seeing them in the hole, getting a ladder, getting down in the hole with them, looking around and being like, this sucks. And it's kind of experiencing that moment with them. And from a counseling perspective, that happens a lot. There's a lot of times where I've been in therapy sessions with someone, and they've talked about something that's been a little more sensitive or tender or upsetting to them, and you just sit there with them in that moment and experience that emotion with them. And sometimes there's not words to say,
right?
But you're just there with them, experiencing that with them, and that's empathy. That's that ability to be there and be present with them in that moment.
Yeah, that concept, that analogy, just again similar to the other ones you've described, like the pendulum and things, has just been really, really helpful for me to understand it. Because in my brain, which we talked about this, I think, in either part 1 or part 2. My brain wants to then, okay, I'm down in the hole with them. I've listened to them. Let's find a solution. Let's get out of the hole, right? Yeah. And that's not always. You don't need to be doing that.
No, because that can be very invalidating.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we want to do. Sometimes we want to fix the problem. We want to say, hey, here's the ladder. Let's go.
Yeah.
And it's not that easy.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we're from the outside looking in, we can see what the problem is, or at least we can see what we think the problem is, and we can see what we think the solution is. But people won't appreciate that information.
Yeah.
They'll feel like they're being lectured or told what to do. People need to discover those things for themselves.
Okay.
We talk about that a lot in substance abuse treatment, 12-step groups, like Alcoholics Anonymous and stuff. They have to reach that point where they want to move forward. And it's very similar in other forms of therapy too. They have to reach that point where they want to move forward, where they want to change.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that, because I've heard of 12 steps and addiction. Like oftentimes there's concepts of like enabling, like we're enabling them if we try to solve it for them. We try to force them to go to a treatment facility or force it. Like there's a point where they have to decide it for themselves. And I hadn't heard of that. Yeah. With regards to like mental health as well. So that's And that's why I love that example of being in the hole with them, because you're not necessarily helping them out of the hole. You're not necessarily digging the hole deeper with them. Yeah. You're just there with them in the hole. And if they make the decision to get themselves out of the hole, like you can be there with them.
Sure.
But you don't have to, here's a shovel or here's the ladder or whatever. Yeah.
And if we're going to speak metaphorically, I may at one point even show the patient or the client how to use the ladder.
Yeah.
I may even,
But they have to decide. They're like, okay, I'm ready for it.
Right. Yeah. There may be some of those types of conversations that happen, but I'm not gonna tell them, hey, you need to stop this, right? Or hey, you need to, it's a process of self-discovery, right?
Is that so? To kind of lead into the first two things you mentioned here at the beginning was identifying the problem, either in an employer or in an employee or in yourself or whatever, and then like, how do we fix or how do we improve or solve that kind of issue that's going on? Coming from an employer's standpoint, if we're truly feeling empathy, we don't necessarily want to go in with the ladder or the shovel. We don't want to go in and say, I've noticed you seem a little sad. Yeah. Let me go buy you a Red Bull or whatever. Let me fix this for you.
Right.
That might not be the best route to take. What can an employer do, or maybe just a coworker? Maybe it's just I'm on a crew with a friend of mine. I consider a friend. He's a coworker, and we're in a van going to clean carpets or going to take care. How do I address that with a coworker of mine? Yeah. Like how can I help them fix that problem? Fix is probably the wrong word, but how do I address that?
I don't know if there's a right answer to that.
Okay.
But let me share a recent experience I had with you that maybe will help. So the hospital I work in, you can imagine, sometimes gets a little hairy, right? And I say this, I'm probably going to laugh a little bit, and I want to preface this that I mean no disrespect to the patients that I work with by saying this. We use humor a lot in this industry to cope with the horrible things that we see.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure the restoration industry isn't all that dissimilar.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. There's definitely.
You guys see some horrible stuff, and humor is how we cope with horrible things at times. Right. And there'll be times when patients will use their own body waste in inappropriate ways. Okay. Fecal fiascos is what we call those sometimes. And we had one of those one afternoon, and it was particularly smelly.
Yes.
And my office is on the unit, and we were all struggling with it. And the nursing staff, bless their hearts, they were cleaning it up, and the patient was being taken care of, and we were all doing the best we could to cope. And my supervisor at the time called me up and she said, hey, are you, you're on the unit? And I said, yeah. And she said, hey, I got something for you. And so she comes over and she's carrying a brown paper bag.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. And she hands me the bag. I put my hand out. She hands me the bag. She sets it in my hand and it's warm.
Oh,
and I'm like,
no.
oh no. And I could tell she's trying not to laugh. And I look inside and her and another employee who had taken like a Butterfinger and a Tootsie Roll
and melted it.
And melted all down.
Oh, no.
And excuse the statement, but she said, heard you were having a shitty day.
Oh, no. Oh my gosh.
And it was awesome.
Yeah.
It was awesome. It was exactly what I needed to hear. It was exactly what needed to happen. Again, I mean, no disrespect to the patient who was involved. People when they're not in their right mind, they do things they regret or that they don't realize. But humor goes a long way.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that on some of these crews where you're really tight knit and you know each other's personality, you know what you can get away with, you know what's acceptable and what's not within the culture of that group. Humor can help.
Yeah.
Because it alleviates that stress, it alleviates that tension. And I think more than anything, maintaining an environment where something like that can happen and you can just laugh about it and you can just be like, all right, that's cool. You know? And I hate to say it, this is 2-3 months later, that little chocolate concoction is still sitting on my desk. That thing's loaded with so many preservatives, it hasn't grown a lick of mold on it, but it's still sitting on my desk in that paper bag, and I still look at it and laugh. Because it's a great reminder of not only the support I have from my coworkers, but crap happens.
Yeah.
And you got to cope with that. You got to deal with it sometimes. And so I mean, recognizing, having that humor, having that ability to just, talk to one another and just be able to make light of a situation. Not to make light of necessarily their suffering, but the situation for what it is.
I love it. I think that's a great option, right? Like you said, there's no perfect answer to this question.
There's not.
And so I think I'm trying to come up with a solution for a problem that maybe doesn't have a solution, right? I think you kind of answered you kind of solved the problem with your first answer, which is maybe at times we just need to have more empathy. And empathy in and of itself is not providing a solution. So maybe just, going back to our episode last week with Marcy Richardson, she described that in her office, she's kind of set up her office as director of HR as a safe space, that she just goes there and just listens to employees' problems at times. And sometimes there's yelling and screaming and people vent and come to her, and there's probably the occasion where it has to be elevated to a manager, an owner, or whatever, but most of the time it's just an opportunity for employees to vent, and she listens to their problems and is aware of what's going on and gets it down in the hole and suffers with them a little bit. And then they're okay after that. Yeah. And maybe that at times that's what our coworkers need or our employees need. Maybe they just need someone to listen and listen to their problems.
Yeah, and on that note too, I would think that it's maybe a bigger discussion than what we can have here, but in those tight-knit work groups, right, we can't be holding on to grudges.
Yeah.
Right, because those are gonna make those types of safe spots, right? That's a buzzword, but those types of safe spots, those kind of safe places, harder to have.
Yeah.
If someone is feeling animosity towards someone else, they're not going to be able to have that conversation. And holding on to that animosity, holding on to that grudge, it's just going to make things worse.
Yeah.
And so, if you've got a concern or a problem with a coworker, I would also say talk to them about that too.
Yeah.
Don't just reserve the times to talk when things are good.
Yeah. I love that. I think something that we've kind of started here, and we don't have a director of HR, but we've hired an individual that comes in and helps out with kind of some of our HR, not problems, but helps out with things like benefits and employee programs and different things like that. And he's been great training. He's been awesome. His name's Shane Campbell, and he's been awesome to have. We actually interviewed him on the podcast a few months ago. But one thing that we've kind of started with him is we do these quarterly check-ins, and they're not. It's not part of an annual or semi-annual review. They're completely separate of those things, and they generally take about 10 to 15 minutes. And it's just, hey, how are things going? What can we do to help your day be better? What are some ways that, are you feeling stressed? Like, is there anything we can do to help lighten the load for you here at work? Having some of those check-ins, like you're saying, don't just check in when you notice they're depressed or they're late or, so they don't feel like they're getting called into the principal's office. Like, maybe just check in every once in a while and have some conversations about how are things going? Yeah. What can we do to make your day better? Like,
we talked about this in the second episode. I think we got to get away from the idea that conflict is bad.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We can have a conversation, we can have a conversation on content that we don't agree on and still be agreeable in the manner which we converse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
So,
yeah, I think there's, and I think the only way to get over that is making it a little bit more of a consistent thing.
Yes.
You can't.
We spoke about that too.
Yeah. There's got to be some consistency. You've got to feel like you can trust people at work.
Yeah.
Again, Marcy, going back to kind of what we talked about last week with her, but Marcy talked about having some integrity in the workplace and knowing your employees have to be able to trust you.
Yes.
In order for them to bring their problems to you. If they don't trust you, they feel like you're going to stab them in the back. Like they're never going to tell you that there's a problem. And pretty soon it's going to snowball until it's, the point of no return. So I think, you've got to establish some trust with the people around you, have some consistency, show up and have, I don't know if it's a monthly or a quarterly check-in like what we do, but there's probably a different solution for every workplace.
Yeah.
But find what works for you and have some consistency there.
And I would say, don't be afraid to try.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to try something new. Don't be afraid to try something different. And what's the worst that'll happen is it won't work, and you just got to try a different intervention again another time.
Yeah.
Right. And you'll be vulnerable. It'll take you being vulnerable. It'll take you being worried that you might fail or that it might not work out. And what's the worst that'll happen? You'll embarrass yourself a little bit, and the world won't end. You might have an employee who gets a little upset at you or something, but try a different way next time.
Try something different.
Yeah.
I want to make sure it was probably my favorite piece that we talked about in the first two episodes. So I want to make sure we hit on it one more time. I often, what I've tried to be better at doing is looking internally for solutions instead of looking externally, right?
Yeah.
So if I notice a problem in work or at home, and I'm far from perfect at this, I try to think, maybe after I've gotten frustrated and maybe yelled at someone that I shouldn't have or said something I shouldn't have, I often look back and say, okay, what do I got to do better internally to solve this? And I think that goes really well with your concept in the first, part one or part two, about emotional flexibility.
Yeah.
You wouldn't mind maybe kind of refresh audience a little bit. It's been a couple of weeks. Define what emotional flexibility is and how do we better enhance that within ourselves.
Yeah.
So that we can be a better employee, a better coworker, all of those things.
I think that goes back to my secret of life.
Yes, the happiness, the secret to life.
Yeah. The idea about the difference between expectation and reality.
Yes.
And the more difference there is, or the more space there is between what we expect from the world and what we're actually getting, the more that space fills with pain and chaos and unfulfilled things. And the more of that we have in our life, the more frustration we experience, the more sadness we experience, anxiety, depression, all that other kind of stuff. So if you want more happiness in your life, you need to bring expectation and reality in line with each other.
Closer together.
Yeah, closer together. And I would say emotional flexibility is the ability to do that, to recognize and navigate life's issues so that you're able to maintain that balance. When we look at behaviors, and this is an oversimplification, but I think it helps. I think it's good though. Behavior is kind of comprised of two ways of thinking, right? Emotional thinking and rational thinking.
Yeah.
And if we're completely emotionally driven, I think we talked about this some.
Yeah, I think we might have touched it. Yeah.
If you're fully emotionally driven, then your life is pure chaos. Yeah. And if you're purely rationally driven, your life has no passion, no purpose, no enjoyment. It's boring.
Frankly, yeah.
And so emotional flexibility is that ability to recognize in any given situation how much rational and how much emotional thought I need for my behavior in any given situation so that I can move in a way that helps me reach what my goals are.
Love it.
And so if I want to be emotionally flexible, I need to be able to recognize that my behavior can be influenced by those two things and that I have control over those two things. Yeah. And I have to acknowledge that and accept that. Now, as far as how to do that, it's a different story.
Yeah, that's the emotional flexibility thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's some things that you can do. I think that in DBT, dialectic behavior therapy, one of the big things they stress is mindfulness. Okay. And for me, for example, one of the things I do in my life that I find very helpful, and I've been doing this a lot lately, is I take like a 15, 20-minute walk every day.
Love it.
During work. During one of my breaks, I walk around campus. We've got a lot of beautiful trees. This time of year is actually great because all those trees are in blossom, are in bloom, so there's a lot of really nice smells and stuff. I don't access my phone during that walk. I don't really talk to anybody. I just kind of focus on my senses. Yeah. What is it I'm smelling? What is it I'm hearing? What is it I'm seeing? And that's what I focus on, is I just focus on those things. And if I have thoughts that come into my head that are other than related to what my senses are registering, I'll acknowledge that thought and I'll let it go. And then I'll just focus back on to, again, what it is I'm seeing, what I'm smelling, what I'm feeling, what I'm hearing. Yeah. And it's just kind of this meditation, almost meditative process. And it's just being mindful and in the moment. And so the more we can focus on the now, right, the more we're bringing expectation and reality into line. Because if we're focused on tomorrow, that brings anxiety. And if we're focused on yesterday, then that brings doubt and regret.
Yeah.
And so we want to eliminate those two things and bring it to the now. And so that process of mindfulness and taking that few minutes every day to practice that mindfulness helps you bring those two things into line.
I think a lot of what you're talking about is really helps us, like, again, my thought process of like looking internally and like, how can I be better? I think if we could turn this a little bit into, I'm gonna offer an idea as far as turning this a little bit more into like an employer's mindset. How do they bring expectations to reality? And feel free to correct me, because I obviously am not the professional here. But I watched a video on, I can't remember if it was on YouTube or it was just on social media somewhere, but I watched a video recently where this guy was at some kind of business owner conference and he was getting some coaching from a gentleman. And the guy that was getting the coaching was like, I cannot get my employees to really want to work hard. Yeah. I'm putting in 80 hours a week and I just cannot get my employees to work hard. And the guy that was giving the teaching was like, well, your employees don't own the business. Like they're never going to work as hard as you, because this is your baby. Like that's just a fact of the matter. You pay them to do a job. They're going to do that job. And that's kind of going to be the end of the story, right? They don't own the business like you do. And so I think going back into your conversation of expectations for reality, I think an employer, a business owner can help improve their own mental health. They can bring their expectations a little bit more into reality and understand that, hey, I pay my employees to do X, Y, and Z. They go out and do X, Y, and Z, and they complete the job. Awesome. If I've created a safe work environment for them to complete those things and they're happy and healthy, great. I'm not going to expect them to go and explode my business for me and give the same effort that I give on a day-to-day basis because they don't own the business, right? And so I think, again, just kind of giving an analogy of bringing expectations more in line with reality, I think that's going to improve an employer's mental health as well. Does that sound in line with what you're talking?
I agree. I think you can apply that logic to any aspect of our life. I mean, look at relationships between a husband and a wife. How many times have you thought you've been with your wife and you've thought, well, why isn't she doing this, or why isn't she doing that? And this is the internal dialogue going in your head, right?
Yes.
And there's this expectation, right? And then there's the reality of her behavior, or vice versa. Or, how many times a wife is thinking about how her husband is behaving, right? And you can swing it around from the employee to the employer perspective, right? Yep. How many employees are out there thinking, well, my employer needs to be doing this and this and this, and so I mean, this is a huge concept, and it's a very deep concept, and it's easy to talk about, but it's difficult to put into practice.
But like you're saying, it really will solve. We mentioned in the first two episodes the two biggest mental health illnesses that we notice just out in the world is generally anxiety and depression.
Depression, yeah.
And anxiety is a big one of those, right? So anxiety is one of those two. I feel like it would solve a lot of anxiety in life in general, relationships, whatever it might be, and in the workplace if we could get on the same page with our expectations, bring those as close to reality as we can. I think that removes a lot of the anxiety and probably helps with some of the depression aspects as well. Is like, my work day sucked because it wasn't what I thought it was going to be.
Right.
Or this relationship, my relationship with my wife is not great because of this, right? Like it's not up to my expectations. If we can find ways to bring those a little closer to reality, like our lives, I hate using the word happier because, again, your secret to life is not necessarily that life is always sunshine and rainbows, but I think we will probably be happier in the long run if we can bring, our expectations closer to reality.
Yeah, and ACT therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, talks a lot about this, and it replaces that idea of happiness with what's good for me. Yeah. Right. It's no secret I'm a big guy. I like to eat. I like good food.
Right there with you, man. Right there with you.
Good food makes me happy. Yeah. Give me a nice bacon cheeseburger, right? It's going to get those, that dopamine flowing, right? That's a good experience, or happy experience. But is that good for me?
Right.
Every day? Probably not.
Right? Probably not.
And so ACT would say that I need to adjust my behavior. Well, I need to look at what's good for me. Right.
Love it.
In line with what my values are. And then I need to set my goals in line with that. And that's where, that process, emotional flexibility is just one part of that process of bringing those two things into line. The other part of that process is understanding what your motivations are, which are what our values are, understanding what your values are, and then setting goals that are in line with those values to keep you moving forward.
Love it.
Even just as simple as, what's one thing that I could do today that if I could do it, I would do it, that would make me better today than I was yesterday. Right?
Speaking my language.
Yeah, just, one thing, that's going to keep me moving forward.
It's my favorite concept is that I want to be a percentage point or less. I want to be a little bit better today than I was yesterday. And if I am, that's a win. If you could really distill it
up over time.
Yeah. If you could really distill it down to that, I want to be better than I am today than I was yesterday, and be better tomorrow than I am today, which is, I think, at times a hard concept to admit. I think people, a lot of times we get in this rut of, this is who I am. This is Hayden. Hayden's not going to change. And if you don't love me for Hayden, if you don't love Hayden for Hayden, then screw you, right? And it's like, I don't think that's the right mindset to have. Like, I want to be better tomorrow,
right?
And I hope I'm better tomorrow. I hope I look back. We often, I think, look back at our high school or younger selves and are like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed by how dumb and how much of a jerk I was, right?
Sure.
And I think that's a good thing. I think we should feel that way, and I feel that way about who I was yesterday and last week. Like, I want to be better today than I was. And I think that's a really simple concept.
Well, that value, and I'm overgeneralizing here maybe a little bit with you, but that value of self-improvement is what justifies the pain in your life.
Yeah.
Just to psychoanalyze for a second, right?
Yeah, of course.
But the things that you endure, right, all the horrible things that happen in your life, that happen in everybody's life, are worth it to you because you have this drive of self-improvement. And that's amazing. That's wonderful that you found that. And when people can find that thing that makes it worth it, that's what, in counseling, that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to help them find. What is that thing that makes it worth it, right? What is that thing that makes the grueling day today worth it? And it's just figuring that out.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Well, I hope everyone's enjoyed Hayden's therapy session. We've had a live look into, we might as well just sat down and you could have just charged me for the hour and then we could have just taken care of this. But, it's awesome. This has been super insightful for me and I know for our audience as well.
Sure.
I appreciate you coming back on as kind of a way to recap and kind of close out Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yeah.
I want to talk to our audience a little bit and say that this is not the end for mental health awareness. We want to continue to push forward and have more conversations about this topic. I think that's how we destigmatize it. Some of the people closest to me in my life struggle with mental illness, and I probably do as well. And it probably hasn't been diagnosed as it should be, but I think there are opportunities in our lives to help us all be a little bit better and improve some of these mental health aspects. And so we're going to continue to talk about it. It'll probably be a common topic we'll bring on. We'll bring up in episodes in the future, and we'll probably have you on in the future as well, Ashton.
Happy to come back.
Just to kind of cap it off, we've already kind of bugged you a little bit about some book recommendations and some things you've given us, but if you could kind of just leave us with one final thought, if somebody in our audience is out there struggling, whether it's an employee or an employer, where would you direct them? What would be a resource that you would send them today? If we got a call after this episode aired and said, gosh, I was really struggling with this going on in my workplace, where would you send them?
That's a good question. I'm unprepared on that one.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm throwing you a curveball here.
That's okay.
I think last time you recommended some books from Brene Brown.
Yeah, I recommended Brene Brown, Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Living is a great book.
Love it.
Really talks a lot about putting your life in order.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's the subtitle is an antidote to chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way to describe that. That's a great book. There's another book out there. The author slips my mind at the time, and it's been a while since I've read it, but it's called Flow.
Okay.
FLOW, and it's this. The concept is this idea that we can this idea that we can set up our environment for like optimal success, right?
Yeah.
And get ourselves in this situation where reaching those goals, we remove as many of the barriers as we can.
Well, and it goes back to your concept of patterns, right? Like we can establish a healthy pattern.
Yeah.
We can set ourselves up for health or for self-improvement in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Exactly. But on a more anecdotal note, just if anyone is struggling, I just would leave them with just hope.
Yeah.
The sun's going to come up tomorrow, right? Yeah. I mean, it might be hard today. You might feel like you're struggling today, but it's not always going to be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. Yeah. And the sun will come up tomorrow. Things are going to get better, and you'll find a reason. You'll find your purpose, and it'll just take time, but you will find it.
Love it, Ashton. That's a great way to cap off Mental Health Awareness Month. So really, really appreciate you coming on. Thanks again for being our resident expert here on the show. And I know we're going to have you on in the future, but thanks again. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
This has been Success Elevated, making you a little bit better one show at a time. Thanks for joining us. Please subscribe on YouTube or any other major podcast platform to listen to more episodes. We are proudly brought to you by Spot On Solutions. If you'd like to learn more about how we can help you grow your business, please check us out at spotonsolutions.com.